Hi there. This is the September edition of the Drawing the Ideal Self podcast. I am sorry it's a little late, but I've got a good excuse, and I'll tell you about that in the podcast today. For those of you who haven't listened before, the idea of this podcast is to help you to understand PCP a bit better, and it's particularly aimed at people who are beginning their PCP journey or who have been around a while and would like some refreshers. It's a monthly podcast and topics for it will be decided by me. So if you've got some particular ideas, it'd be great to hear from you, and you can email me at drawingtheidealself@icloud.com. Please do get in touch if there's something you think, okay, I wonder if there's a PCP view of that, or how would PCP help in this situation? Anything really, and I'll see what I can do. So today's podcast is going to be about the Kellian idea of guilt. So this week on Wednesday, I became a retired psychologist, at least in part. A very strange idea for me because I've been working for so many years, but it came to my 60th birthday, and what I decided to do was use that as a point to have a sort of renewal of opportunities to do other things and to take my retirement from my current role. This turned out to be a much bigger deal than even I had thought about. Quite funny really, given that I've had plenty of time, i.e. a whole career, to consider what I might do at the point of retirement. So my retirement date I fixed quite a long time ago, probably 3 or 4 years ago, maybe even 5. I'd decided that on the day of my 60th birthday, that would be my last day in that role. That didn't mean I wasn't ever going to work again, because that isn't going to happen. But it meant that I was going to have an opportunity for a change. And when I was in the run-up to that for all the years beforehand, all I could think about was all the sides of the change that I was looking forward to. I was planning all kinds of things, some of which have been rather disrupted by COVID, like being able to travel. I had this sort of image of myself in a camper van, being able to sit in a campsite in France or in Italy, drinking a nice glass of wine, still being able to be in touch with people through the Wi-Fi, still being able to work remotely. And actually the remote working has become even more possible now. So if it wasn't for COVID, I definitely would be there. And I was imagining doing all kinds of things. You know, I am learning to play tennis. I wanted to do that more. I want to do some art stuff, even though I'm no good. And I don't really mind not being any good at it, because I'm there to learn rather than to be competent. I want to have more time to see my family. I want to have more time to see my friends. So I could think about all these advantages to being retired. And I went over and over those things. And I suppose there were some things that got in the way of that, mainly time when I was working. So I couldn't do all of those things that I wanted to do because there wasn't enough time in the week. So in anticipation of retirement, I was thinking, wow, this is all going to be fantastic. In the week before I actually retired, probably for about 8 or 9 or 10 days, I suddenly became extremely sad. It was a really sudden thing. So I was okay, all looking at the bright side. And then suddenly I realised the enormity of what I was doing. So I have worked with children and families since I was 21, so a long time. Before that, I did various kinds of voluntary roles, working with kids, but not with parents as well. And I absolutely love that. I love being in the room with people, trying to see if I can be helpful to them, listening to what they have to say, hearing how they understand their lives and what's happened to them, and trying to help them get unstuck from stuck situations. To me, it's an absolute privilege to have that opportunity. And in particular, to help people who otherwise wouldn't be able to get help. So that meant working in the NHS was a big thing for me, or the local authority before that when I was an educational psychologist. So very keen to be somebody who was providing services to a full range of people, and also making sure there was access for the most needy and the poorest in our society. And I've been really lucky in that. I've had lots of different experiences and I've had lots of great jobs. I've ended with this one, but I've had other jobs before that where I was working with different groups of clients, and it has never, ever, ever been boring. I've not had a day where I've thought, oh, that's a terrible day. I've had challenging days where I've thought they were terrible because they were really, really hard, but not because they were dull. And one of the things that I really value is my experiences being interesting to me. And that's been very apparent every time anybody has done any PCP stuff with me, that always comes up. So my job had allowed me to elaborate the parts of myself that mattered to me. And over time, they had become my core role. This is what Kelly said about core role and guilt. One's deepest understanding of being maintained as a social being is one's concept of one's core role. Perception of one's apparent dislodgement from one's core role structure constitutes the experience of guilt. It is the loss of status within core role constructions which is experienced as guilt. So Kelly's idea is really different from the definition of guilt that we would normally have, which means feeling bad about something that we've done. His idea is that it's related to being dislodged from a core role. So that could be a parent whose child dies, who because the child is no longer there, they are no longer a parent. For me, it's about being a psychologist working within the NHS service as a psychologist working with children and families, and being dislodged from that core role because the role I will be going back to won't have that same flavour about it. It's a really interesting idea and very, very useful. So I've worked with many parents who have struggled a great deal with something like the diagnosis of a condition that their child has. So if you took something like autism, it might be that a parent would struggle with the idea of how they can be a parent now this child is known to be autistic. So their idea of who they are and how they play out that role of parent is affected by the diagnosis of autism. They might feel very comfortable that they know how to be a parent until that point. And at that point, they're dislodged from their core role and may become quite depressed or very sad or very frightened. They can be trapped in either being hostile in Kellyan terms and trying to pretend it isn't happening, which I guess is a bit like I was doing, but I'm not anymore. Or they can become distressed by the enormity of the change that this guilt is pointing to. For example, as in a parent whose child has died, they didn't want to go back to being a non-parent person. And for those kind of situations, guilt is a very good idea to help us understand what someone might be going through. It doesn't direct us to whether someone feels bad about it. They feel uncomfortable, and they will feel increasingly uncomfortable the bigger that core role is. Kelly talked about how we might try and help somebody in therapy when the issue is around guilt. And there are 4 things he suggested. The first one of those is a reconstruction of that core role. And that means helping the client to see how his part in life meets the needs of other people. So for me, the reconstruction of my core role of psychologist is about trying to find a way to still be a psychologist, because I really don't want to stop that, but without that being in the NHS or in a local authority, because I also want to have more freedom. And obviously I can't have everything my own way. People have to run their services and I'd have to turn up when they said so. So it's trying to find a way that I can still be a psychologist in the way that I want to and work with the people that I want to, because that really matters to me, and find a way forward with it. And at the moment, I'm still trying to work out exactly how that will be. Part of my role as a psychologist, obviously, is thinking about how things work and systems and the way that people interact and services interact. And I do have an ongoing role, which is about trying to find a different way of thinking about how people find help rather than by a diagnosis. It's a very interesting job that I'm going to be doing, but it fulfills part of my core role as psychologist. It certainly does a lot of it, but that bit about being in the room with a parent, a child, a family, a teacher, a social worker, a whoever, but the aim is to help a child, that bit I've got to find a new way to do. So that reconstruction of my core role means trying to find a way to be the psychologist I think I am or would like to be and make it happen. And I think 10 days ago, the sadness that kicked in was about thinking whether or not that was possible and still being able to have the freedoms that I want to have. And I think I suddenly realised it might be more difficult than I anticipated. The second way Kelly suggested helping somebody with guilt was to find alternative role structures. And what he said that means is helping the client to find alternative roles to replace the one that they feel they've lost. Now, in therapeutic terms, what he suggested is that meant giving the client some tasks to do, trying to work out what their vocation would be if that's where they were going, trying to find the right job or choosing a course or taking a community responsibility. Those were things that he suggested. So they're the things that people will find alternative ways to satisfy their idea of themselves as a particular kind of, for me, psychologist. So from that point of view, that one of the things that I would need to be looking at is what I am actually going to do and what kind of things are going to be okay for me, and finding something which can replace a thing that I feel I've lost without losing out on some of the things I want to gain. So when I got to thinking about this properly, which I actually did through thinking about guilt for myself, what I realised is probably that's going to be something in the voluntary sector, because that means I won't have to keep writing about it in the same way. It will also mean that I've got some ongoing relationships with children and families through a system, and that I'll be working as part of some kind of organisation that would like a volunteer to do those things. Not quite sure how that's going to look, but perhaps it'll be in a school. The third thing that Kelly suggested was about the interpretation of persons. So he talked about the interpretation of figures and actual persons to whom that client would normally delineate his role. And he talked about using role play to reenact new ways of being with that person. Now that works if it's somewhere that, let's say if somebody's lost their job, but they're still a family person living with their partner and kids, they're living in a house, working out the kind of mum or dad or husband or wife or partner you're going to be at the same time as losing your job and therefore not having that work role. That makes sense. So what he talked about using there was role reenactment procedures. So playing out some of those roles and seeing how they go and coming back and discussing them in the therapy room so that you can evaluate them well. That's really using the person as scientist idea, so that you go away, experiment in the real world and come back and discuss the results of your experiments, and then revise your construction of whatever this new role is going to be, maybe it have a new name, as you go along. And that happens repeatedly. I could imagine that being relevant for me if I, let's say, took up a role in a school and then got involved in some of the work there, helping the kids with special needs maybe, and then could think about whether that would actually be the thing for me. The fourth thing that Kelly talked about was broadening the base of role relationship to the therapist. So he talked about that because what he was concerned about was what sort of therapy that would be to help this person, And it might be that during this time of reconstruction of such a major event as a loss of role like this, that the therapy appointments would need to be increased. And they also might need to cover areas that hadn't been in the original plan for therapy, but were now relevant. And he said that would be a temporary situation. The thing that really helped me with this was thinking about what I was going to lose in terms of the role and whether I would lose it all. I think that before I got close up to retirement, I was sort of thinking of an either or. And I wasn't thinking of the changes. If you imagine a 5-day week, I wasn't imagining the changes of 3 days. I was just not thinking about it. And perhaps that was because it was such a big deal. Perhaps it was because I was too busy. Perhaps it was because I had convinced myself that everything was going to be okay. And to be honest, the sadness took me really by surprise. So I was very careful in the run-up to the retirement day not to spend time in situations where that could spill out, which basically meant avoiding some things at work where people might ask me about how I was feeling, because I wasn't at that point able to put it into words, but I felt the discomfort. So the other bit that's really important about guilt is that it's not connected with doing bad. So in my situation, it's nothing to do with having done something wrong, but the guilt is there. Now, what Kelly talked about was quite interesting, because he was saying that there is a relationship between punishment and guilt, but it tends to be an institutionalised one. He said that punishment is not a necessary or fundamental motivating factor in human life. We see a relationship between punishment and guilt simply because certain groups of people have construed such a relationship, yet it need not be. Now that's important, because if you imagine people going to prison, they will not all experience guilt. In fact, probably lots of them won't experience any guilt, because it won't necessarily involve any change of a core role for them. The core role that might affect me if I went to prison is related to having freedom and choice and being able to do what I want to do when I think I should, or if I can't make that final decision, having the ability to go and negotiate it. I know there are a lot of people in society who don't have those advantages. And for some of those people, going to prison is just another place to enact their core role. If you took drug dealers, going to prison will mean that they have a different group of people to find a way to sell them drugs. They'll have to find different ways to do it, but their core role as drug dealer doesn't have to change because they're imprisoned. Obviously, that'd be really different for somebody who was a social worker, because they're probably not going to be able to be a social worker again. And there isn't a great way of being a social worker in prison without inherent risks. So for the drug dealer, the experience of being in prison doesn't necessarily cause them any distress. They may be distressed about not being able to go out and do what they want to do, but they can still have a security in knowing how things work, because they can move into the prison environment, they can find their patch within that, they can sell their drugs, they can do the deals, they can get their suppliers, all things that they had previously been able to do. So they don't necessarily feel guilt in the experience of having done wrong and gone into prison. Bannister in 2005 summed this up really nicely. He said, "Your core role structure is what you understand yourself to be. Guilt is experienced not because one has defied and upset social taboos, but because you have misread yourself." When I read that, I thought, yes, that is exactly what happened with me. I misread myself. I didn't think about that loss of core role. I didn't consider what that was going to mean, and I didn't look at it. And then when I had to look at it because it was approaching, I was suddenly really distressed by the prospect. Now that's a few days ago. I don't feel like that at all. And in fact, at my absolutely fantastic leaving do, I didn't feel upset. I felt I was at the beginning of something rather than at the end. And that was because I'd had time to process it properly and to think through this idea and consider what that might have meant for me. And in fact, I made a version of this podcast last week, and it's slightly different from the one I'm making today, because at that point I had only just come out of that period. But I knew that I was going to be okay in my final week. The guilt was about me relating to other people relating to me in a different role, in a different way maybe, and not knowing what that was going to be like. So definitely around a transition. And Kelly's, what he called the transitional constructs, or the professional constructs, are the things that are about those transition points. So these concepts are to do with moving from a situation to a situation, or a situation you're in now to an unknown. And those are the times when people really get stuck. And clearly, last week, I was stuck. So, how did I help myself? Well, at the time that I was so distressed, the guilt bit was about losing the whole of my core role. I was anticipating the whole of it changing. So not being in the same team, not seeing the people who I work with now, not seeing the place that I am, and also not seeing the children and families and other professionals that I work with. I'm not really sure why I was doing that, because I always knew that I was going to go back. Anyway, I suppose that shows how stuck people can get. So what I did in terms of my reconstruction is I went through all the different parts of it, and I thought about whether I was going to have to change all of them. And that reduced the change to a much smaller amount of stuff. So I knew that I could still see the colleagues that I work with now, because I'm going to be part of that team, but on the periphery. I'll be able to see them in a morning call. I could go and speak to them. I could call them. I could meet with them face to face if that ever happens again. So that part of it, I wasn't going to be losing. I'm also going to be part of the same organisation, although instead of an emphasis on children and families, there's going to be a lot wider emphasis in also working with services for adults. However, I will still have that contact, and we have a couple of projects going on with Dimensions which are exactly about working with children's services. So that also would mean I would have ongoing contact and an indirect way of helping those children and families. Part of my new role will inevitably involve talking with parents and hopefully talking with kids, and certainly talking with other professionals about their use of Dimensions and how they'd like to see it develop and what they think of it so far. So that contact with them will be lost in some ways, but that loss will be specific to therapy rather than it being general. The other part was physical, and that's about belonging to the same building and going to the same place, which is already very familiar to me because I've been there for years. So that won't change either. So that will be the base that I would use as part of this new role. So what I was able to do was go through all of these things and then be left with the nub of the problem, and that although there's a core role shift, it's less devastating. So the task that I've given myself to do is to find a way to find some kind of work with children and young people which definitely involves therapy or coaching, and allows me to have that contact with them, but in a different kind of way and maybe voluntary. I'm sure even without PCP, I could have worked that one out. But for me, the PCP gives me something to hang it on. I think the concept of guilt is so useful, and it absolutely applies, as Kelly said, things should be reflexive. It applies to me as much as it does to everybody else or the people I try and help. And I think that was really handy to have in my back pocket so that when I was experiencing this distress, I could address it. And I have to say, that's why I'm here. That's why I'm doing this podcast, because this isn't just about me and other people using PCP in therapy. It's finding PCP useful in daily life. That's why I want to do this podcast, because I want to show that it's more than that. And for those people who are new to it, to get them to think about how PCP relates to themselves as well. So one of the things that Kelly said is the theory must be reflexive. It must apply to other people and to the self. So for me, it's about, can I use PCP in my work? Yes, with children and parents. Yes, with teachers. Yes, with social workers. Yes, with other professionals. Yes, with organisations. And also me, my family, my decision making. I'm able to use PCP with all of those things and help myself to move on. And I suppose that's one of the things that I'm hoping for with this podcast. People will see that the concepts in PCP are really, really useful. And what's more, you don't have to pay to get them. You can read the book yourself. It's not expensive to follow an interest in PCP, which is another thing that I like about it. It can be a little inaccessible at times because some of Kelly's wording is really now quite old-fashioned. And that's the other reason that I'm doing this podcast, to try and put it into ordinary English. So there we go. Interesting that I didn't know at the end of last month what I was going to do this month. And I'm not sure what next month's might be, except I'm hoping Diane Allen will be willing to be interviewed for the next month's podcast. We shall see. She is definitely willing to be interviewed, but I'm not sure if we'll get it in to be broadcast next time or if it'll be the time after. And I want to give a call out again. Anybody who listens who thinks, I wouldn't mind being interviewed about why I use PCP and how it's useful, I would love to talk to you. We'd probably do it as a Zoom interview, because I understand I can record that and isolate the soundtrack from video track and then put that into the podcast easily. I've learnt that today. So we'd probably do a Zoom interview, and it would probably be 3/4 of an hour to an hour. It won't be any more than that. And I would let you hear what I was proposing would go out. So the idea would be that I interviewed you about where you came across PCP, why you find it useful, if there's anything you particularly want to say about it, and then how you found it useful in your career or in your personal life or whatever it is. And I want to have something which shows the range of people who are using PCP. So I would love to talk to people from all kinds of different backgrounds, either professional backgrounds or non-professional backgrounds, within professions of different professions. I really don't want it to be fixed. So I would love to talk to people who would just be willing to have me talk to them. So please don't think that's not you. If you're interested, I would love to talk to you. You can email me on drawingtheidealself@icloud.com. So there we are. That's September's offering. We'll see what October brings, and definitely we are into autumn now. I'm looking outside my window and it is not a nice day at all. I've got the heating on, all kinds of things that are a change. I do feel a bit cheated because it doesn't seem like we actually had a summer in the usual way. I certainly didn't have a holiday. So it's a very strange time that's ongoing. However, maybe during this time we can give some thought to PCP and see how it might be useful. At those long winter evenings, if you've got nothing to do, you can read a bit of PCP. Okay. Right. I'm off then, and I will see you in October.